Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. As a writer for a program like Breakpoint, there are certain habits you fall into. Some of them are good, like the habit Chuck Colson described of proverbially waking up each morning with the Bible in one hand and the New York Times in the other. But some are bad. One of those habits I've had to fight is the tendency to turn the word culture into a catch-all term for everything in the society around us that is not explicitly Christian. Now, there are a lot of reasons I call this a bad habit. Among them, the fact that there is much good in the world besides things explicitly called Christian. But the biggest problem with this use of the word culture is that it encourages me and others to think of myself, ourselves, and all believers as detached observers, indifferent to the influence of culture, and aren't participating in it. But as my guest today is convinced, that's a serious misunderstanding of our faith and how we relate to the values, assumptions, instincts, beliefs, and aesthetics of those around us. Dr. Justin Bailey is Associate Professor of Theology at Dordt University. He's served as a pastor in diverse settings, is the author of Reimagining Apologetics, and hosts a podcast called In All Things. His latest book is called Interpreting Your World, 5 Lenses for Engaging Theology and Culture, and it promises to create some new and better habits in the way Christians talk, write, and think about this nebulous thing we call culture. Dr. Bailey, welcome to Upstream.
Thanks, Shane. It's really good to be with you.
Well, I regret to say I missed your talk at the Colson's International Conference in Indianapolis a couple of months ago because I was preparing for a breakout interview that I was scheduled to do that same day. But I want to get a sense of how you first came to be interested in this topic. What's your story, and how did you become the culture guy?
Yeah, great question. And first of all, thanks for that intro, which demonstrates that you really got what I was trying to do. And that's always gratifying to an author, to have people understand and translate the thing that you're trying to do, which is really about our habits of cultural engagement. My story is one in which culture has never been a non-ambiguous term for me. And I guess what I mean by that is I'm Filipino-American, half Filipino, half Caucasian. My parents met in the Philippines, married in the Philippines. And then I was born and grew up here in suburban Kansas City. I'm actually at my parents' house right now. So sort of the place where I grew up. And so I grew up in this sort of multicultural household that had multiple ethnic stories. And a big part of my life has been, I've realized, figuring out what does it mean to unite these different stories together under my deepest identity, which is my relationship to Jesus Christ. That's my primary identity, my primary allegiance. But these other stories, these other cultural identities matter, right? Situate the way I see the world, they situate the conversations I have, the sorts of food I like, things like that. And so my professional work in many ways, as I was working as a pastor in a Filipino context, and then in a Korean immigrant context, and then in more Anglo contexts in Pasadena, California, and then now in Sioux Center, Iowa. And really realizing the ways that our ethnic stories shape the way that we hear the gospel, shape the way that we live out the gospel in practices of discipleship. And yet this is also united by this common claim that Jesus has on every person in every culture. And what does it mean to hear that one call of discipleship, but to hear it in our cultural situation? Now, on top of this, you have another way that we talk about culture, which you already alluded to, which is sort of the cultural of the world, whatever that means. And sort of most of the time, I think what people mean is what John means in his letter when he talks about, love not the world, right? So there's this sort of system of thinking that happens apart from God, of imagining that happens apart from God, of institution building that happens apart from God in some sense, in the sense that at least it's not directed towards discipleship. It's not directed towards living for the glory of God. And that's another way that people use culture. But sometimes it's very difficult to disambiguate when we're using it in more of the negative sense, and when we're using it in more of the, I don't know if neutral is the best word. As a Caperian Calvinist, we don't like the word neutral because we don't think anything is neutral, but at least in a way that is human, just is part of being human. is that we have a story, a cultural story, and we were born in a place and we grew up thinking particular things. So the whole idea of culture is the idea of soil, right? You cultivate things, and certain plants grow in certain soil, and certain things are resistant to other sorts of soil. And so I'm interested in those sorts of questions for profoundly personal reasons, a desire to be integrated and have integrity in my own discipleship. And then also for the people that I try to teach and lead and write for, who find themselves in lots of different cultural situations. What does it mean for us to live with integrity and fidelity to the call of Christ, to the call of discipleship, and yet to do that with cultural sensitivity that isn't just a matter of rejecting and replacing, non-Christian music with Christian music, or non-Christian movies with Christian movies, or something like that. So that's the basic heart behind my professional work.
It sounds like providentially your story has given you eyes to see certain things that many Christians, particularly if they don't have a second cultural context to look to. There's no international culture informing or contrasting with the way they look at their culture here in the United States, say. It's just like taken as the water they swim in. It's the air they breathe. It's the kind of place they are. And then you combine that with this inherited, I guess, capitalist sense that things move and exist according to brands. So you can have a Christian brand. Christianity can be treated as a brand. And I'm not trying to be like derogatory or criticize people on that, because I do that same thing, right? But you brought up Christian music, and there's a fun anecdote at the beginning of the book about destroying all your secular music. You have to tell that one. But the idea that Christianity can be a thing that's branded separately from everything else around us comes naturally to us because we're so used to seeing things packaged that way. But it's not that simple. It's not that easy. Talk to us about that, and then tell us the story about the CDs.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I have a friend, Dan Stringer, who talks about Christian faith or evangelicalism. He said, sometimes we treat it as a brand. And if it's a brand, you're like, oh, I don't want this brand anymore. This brand is no longer popular. I'm going to get another brand. But if it is not just a brand, but a space that we live with other people that we care about, it's not something you can just throw off, right? You can't just get rid of, the space that you're in. You are there. That's where you live. Your neighbors are who your neighbors are. These are the facts on the ground, right? You can't extract yourself from. I guess you can extract yourself from it, but it's very difficult to extract yourself from being human, right? And making culture. The story that you're alluding to is the story I start the book with. When I was a youth pastor, and this was 20 years ago, living in Chicago, and I had a student who came to know the Lord, and he decided, I didn't tell him to do this, but he decided he wanted to destroy all of his secular music as an act of discipleship. And so I felt conflicted about it, but I also wanted to honor his desire to make a decisive break with his past, or with the cultural influences that he felt were deformative for him. And so we went to a bridge and threw all of his music in the water. And, so we littered. But I also it just always has stuck in my mind as something that is maybe a picture of the way that Christians do tend to think about their relationship with the larger culture in which they're in, is one of replacement or rejection rather than subversive fulfillment, where we're able to see connection points and challenge points between the gospel and culture, because the gospel does challenge every culture. And there are times when that is maybe not to throw them in the river, but to get rid of your music, or to delete an app from your phone, or, there are times, or to not see certain kinds of movies, right? That is appropriate discipleship in many cases, to remove ourselves from the situation where there might be temptation or deformative influence on our discipleship. But I've found that for most of life in the world, you cannot remove yourself, right? As Paul says, then you would have to go out of the world, right? And so what culture really requires is discernment, right? A more nuanced listening, which is rooted deeply in an allegiance to Christ, but it is willing to listen long and to be patient in order to both live more fruitfully in the midst of culture, but also to share the gospel more faithfully in a language that connects with the heart of the people. Because that student, when he got rid of his music, he still was going to listen to music, but now where was he going to get his music? Well, in this case, maybe he got some Christian music for a while, right? And I'm not sure how long it lasted, that was the only music he listened to. But like I said, there's no way to get outside of it,
well,
right?
You could also check in on how some of his favorite Christian artists are doing spiritually and morally today.
That's right.
It might not be so
Yeah.
great.
That's right. Yeah, and like you were saying, a lot of times it's more of the brand, right? Rather than the authentic questions that are maybe being asked by particular artists, questions that might only find their answer in the gospel. But sometimes people outside the walls of the church are a lot better at asking the questions than people who are inside the walls of the church, because a lot of times inside the walls of the church, because we sort of feel like we have to know all the answers, we don't really ask the questions anymore. And there's something about being a Christian and being secured by Christ that actually makes you more curious and able to explore. As you are rooted in the gospel, you're able to explore and listen to other perspectives and other people because you're rooted somewhere, which is a bit different than if you're just sort of replacing everything in your world with a Christian version of whatever it is. Yeah.
You used the phrase subversive fulfillment a second ago, and I know that has roots in the Kuyperian neo-Calvinist tradition. I interviewed a few months back Christopher Watkin about his book, Biblical Critical Theory, and he's doing much the same kind of thing there. But it seems like there's a conceptual groundwork that you have to lay as a Christian before you can get to that point where you begin to look at something as broad and nebulous as all of secular entertainment, news, and commentary, or something as concrete and specific as a box of secular CDs, right? And say, all right, this is not a thing that I can hermetically seal myself off from in practical terms. Now, if there's trashy stuff, I can get rid of trashy stuff. Like you said, it's like you sit there and you're like, oh, Britney Spears, well, Into the River. Smash Mouth? Oh no, we're keeping that, man. All-star. That sort of thing. I'm trying to remember what was going on 20 years ago. But the idea that we can just cut ourselves off from all of that is misguided. And it's not immediately obvious, I think, to most Christians, especially in our context, why it's misguided. Can you talk to us about our connectedness, our inevitable connectedness with the culture around us?
So the theological ground of all of this is really a high view of God's sovereignty and God's work that continues in the world despite its fallenness. So it's a conviction that the world still belongs to God, that we still live in a world that God has not abandoned out of his incredible grace, has not abandoned creation to corruption. He has not left us alone, but he has covenanted to heal and renew and restore the creation that has been broken by sin. And so because God is committed to doing that, we have confidence that wherever we go in the world, we remain in God's world. And so that means that there is no space where God is not already present and at work. Now, what might not be present is the gospel. The gospel always comes from the outside, as Christ comes from the outside in the incarnation. And so that means that there is no culture that the gospel does not bring a critique to, because it always comes from the outside. But God is already present. God is already at work. And there's, within the neo-Calvinist tradition, a thinker called J.H. Bavinck. So he's the younger Bavinck for people who are keeping track. And he talks about this idea of magnetic points. He was studying, he's a student of religious psychology and other religions, especially Islam and Eastern religions. And he said there seem to be these particular magnetic points that humans cannot escape, but they keep on getting pulled towards again and again and again. And he draws the map a bit differently than I do, but I love that idea of there being magnetic points because we're created in God's image and we live in God's world. Of course, there would be these particular magnetic points like the desire for meaning, the hunger for justice, the desire for beauty, those sorts of things that we cannot efface from our human pursuits in culture. And so that means that anything that humans make are always going to have elements of these sort of magnetic points. There's going to be a pull towards wrestling with a question. Now, they might wrestle with a question in a way that both is trying to find God, but also trying to run away from God. So this is the sort of Augustinian point of the way that we both reach for God and run from God at the same time. But we can't not
even when
ask
we
the question.
steal the pears,
Exactly.
we're still looking for the approval of our friends. There's something good in that.
Yeah, so we can't run from the question. We can run from God, but we can't run from the question that is continually asked to us. And so this is the reason why you find, for example, in Acts chapter 17, when Paul goes to the Areopagus in Athens, and he says, I walked around, right? So I looked at all of your sort of altars, and I saw this altar to the unknown God, and let me tell you about him, right? So he is able to discern within the altar to the unknown God Not just idolatry, though that's certainly there, but he's also able to discern a hunger for something, right? For something more, a sense that they have not quite figured out the way that the universe works, the way that the world works. And he's able to quote some of their poets, so secular poets, and say, rightly have your poets said. And then he says, he quotes a couple of different poets, and I always sort of imagine if Paul were working today, who are the ones he would, rightly has Taylor Swift said. I don't know if it would be Taylor Swift or if it would be, Jordan Peterson, or if it would be, whoever it is, but the fact that Paul is conversant enough with the poetry and the culture of the Athenians, the voices that they found trustworthy, and is able to say there's something right about that, about what they said. Now, of course, Paul will then take them to the cross, right? We'll take them to the resurrection and say, we should not think that God could dwell in a temple made with hands. And then he says, and this day is coming of judgment, where everyone will be judged by the one who he has raised from the dead. And so there you see both the connection points to the hungers in the human heart, but also the way that it's going to have to be challenged by our hungers, our desires, our imaginings, always will eventually be challenged by the person and work of Jesus Christ, because Jesus is the one who comes from the outside. Jesus is the one thing we could never have found by our own genuine searching, by our own ingenuity. He comes as a gift of grace rather than as an achievement of human culture. And when Jesus comes in, though, what happens is he doesn't replace culture, he fulfills it. Right? So if you think about the day of Pentecost, when all these different language speak God-fearers are there and they have all these different languages, and the miracle of Pentecost is not that it becomes one mono language, but that everyone hears the gospel in their own language. So all of those cultural stories, all of those ethnic stories are dignified by the gospel being able to be presented in their own language. And from the beginning, Christian faith has been a faith marked by translation, right? We translate our scriptures into all of these different languages rather than insisting that everybody learn a particular, Greek, and you must learn Greek and Hebrew to read the scriptures. No, you can translate it, and you translate the gospel into different cultural contexts because God has something unique to say to this culture too, to this people too. And so usually what happens when we try to extract ourselves from culture or insist that we must replace culture is we end up replacing one kind of cultural artifact just with another kind of cultural artifact. And a lot of times, because we haven't thought about it as long, the quality is not always as good as testified by some of recent Christian pop culture offerings. Yeah.
Well, there's something insincere and backward about the effort to drive art forward, art being one form of culture, right? Drive art forward purely on the basis of a message or something that you want to say. That becomes propaganda. That we have a word for that. It's not really art, because art exists in some sense for its own sake. It does have messages, but the messages are woven into the beauty, and that's what you're sort of missing there. But this brings up another distinction that you make that I found really helpful. And that is that we often lazily speak of culture saying things. So Christianity says one thing, culture says another thing, or this or that cultural artifact says this or that. But you point out that culture doesn't really say things. That's the wrong verb. There's much more going on there that grabs hold of people on a deeper level. Could you explain that?
I can try because it's one of the things I'm about to say things about it, and so on one level, when you describe anything, you sort of extract, different ideas from it. But it's in the same way that, like you've just alluded to, that if there's a famous story, it might be T.S. Eliot. I'm not sure who it is off the top of my head. But of somebody asking, they read a poem, and then somebody said, well, what does that poem mean? And so he read the poem again, right? Because there's something about the meaning of a poem that cannot be then translated into bullet points, right? Into notes. And Lewis also talks about this when he compares Christianity and science. And he says, well, in science, you find the notes to the poem, but in Christianity, you find the poem itself. And that means that it acts on us in particular ways that are not just, here's a bunch of ideas to be downloaded into our brains. In the same way that if you think about the way that the gospel works or the way that the scripture works, when God gave us the Bible, he didn't give us 501 facts about God, right? He could have done that, right? 501 Spanish verbs, 501 facts about God. Now, what does God do instead? He says, in the beginning, right? And tells a story that starts at the beginning, goes all the way to the end. And through this story, we are meant to find the story of our lives in its pages, what life is about. And so whenever we say the Bible says, there's something right about that because we're trying to draw our theology from Scripture. And yet the way that the Bible says things is by telling us this true story of the world, giving us Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, giving us the letters of Paul and others. And it's forming our imaginations in all of these different ways that are not just sort of saying things with bullet points, right? In the same way that I can read a story like Lord of the Rings, and it does all of these things to me without saying anything, right? And I could translate it into, here are some themes that Tolkien really cares about, right? Of heroic valor and hope and despair. But really, to understand it, you have to read the story, right? In the same way, to really know what the Bible is saying, you have to read the story. You have to read the Bible and find yourself in its pages. And so in the same way, culture forms us not so much by, waking up and saying, here are all the things that I'm saying to you, right? But it's this complex interaction of all of these forces, right? So culture is a field of forces that we move through in which certain things are attractive to us, certain things elicit our desire and our delight and pull us towards them. So you might imagine it as recently I went to this sort of public garden and it was just everything was beautiful. And I felt myself almost gravitationally pulled in particular directions, which it was designed to pull me in those directions because beauty pulls us towards itself. And so you sort of think culture the same way. As we live in the world, we live in a world in which particular things are beautiful to us. Now, they might not actually be beautiful. We might be seduced by a false beauty, but it still affects us not so much by saying a bunch of things, but by its aesthetic appeal. So that's what I sort of mean when I say that culture does so much more than just say things to us, because it's not reducible to the messages. In the same way that if you hear someone say, I love you, it means something different if it is a stranger or your child or your wife or your father, right? Like who is saying it matters, right? And in the same way in culture, if a random person in the street says something, it doesn't matter as much as if a celebrity says something, right? And so just saying that the message itself matters isn't sufficient. You also have to see how all of these things take place in this field of force in which we are always being formed, even if we can't extract all of the particular messages that we must believe or not believe. There is this cumulative effect that culture has on us of cultivating us. Culture is cultivating us, informing us, and pointing us in particular directions. And so a big part of the work of cultural discernment is to discern what are the directions that this is pointing me in? How is this pointing me away from God or towards God? And what does the call of discipleship that's found in the gospel have to say to this direction that it's encouraging me to go?
We'll get into the five lenses in a second here, and this is going to be very relevant to that. But I think this is extremely key, and we need to emphasize this point that, and you talk about it in the book in terms of your students recognizing that some cultural artifact, some piece of entertainment is saying false things, right? It's giving them a false message in some way, but it still means something deeply to them. And that should clue us into the fact that the lenses through which we interpret culture are not just cognitive propositional lenses. It's not, like you said, a list of truths about X or, about life, about morality, about relationships. It's received on different registers than that, and it affects us on different registers. And any analysis of culture or scripture, for that matter, that fails to recognize the multiple levels on which we're receiving and interacting with this stuff that are not simply cognitive and propositional will fail radically at successfully engaging it or successfully discipling people. I think that's very important.
Yeah, that's right. And I have found with many of my students who are wonderful, thoughtful, curious students that they have sort of been trained as Christians to operate on two levels. Either they have been trained to do intellectual worldview critique and to talk about, okay, these are the messages here that we should reject, or this is why the vision of sexuality or the vision of what it means to be human is not correct according to the Bible. Or they've been taught to completely turn off their intellectual apparatus and just amuse themselves, right? I'm just going to listen to it for the beat, or I'm going to just go and let the special effects wash over me. And my students are simultaneously very skillful in being able to compare and contrast worldviews. And yet that rarely actually diminishes their actual lived engagement with culture, right? So they're able to sort of extract themselves and do this.
What I tell people, if I can interject this,
Yeah.
what I tell people is if you care about something, especially when you're talking about movies or books or TV shows, right? If you're engaged in a story, you are not merely being entertained. The reason you care about that is because something on the register of value is being communicated to you and you resonate with it. I don't care if it's, friggin' Halo and Master Chief. The reason you care about that is because he's saving the universe from the aliens, right? I mean, and
Yeah.
you're stepping into those shoes. You could do that with 1,000 different. The reason you care about that rom-com is because it touches something inside of you, right? It's
Yeah,
not
that's
value
right.
free. Nothing's value free.
And the work of discernment, in other words, is not something that first takes place out there going into somebody else's space, but in here, right? To ask the question of, why do I love this? What is the reason why this has begun to become almost, they'll say things like, oh yeah, I watched that show religiously. And they say, oh, well, why did you use that adverb, religiously? Why didn't you just say I watch it regularly? And they're like, oh, I never thought about that. And yet religiously does communicate more accurately their engagement with culture than regularly, right? Because it communicates this depth of concern as well as consistency. For some of them, this is something we did as a family. Every Thursday night, we would watch American Idol together. I don't know if that's when that show is on, but whatever the thing is, or sports, right? We would do this as a family, and it was formative, and it was the way we connected with each other. And asking those questions and finding what are the reasons why this has its hooks in my heart, so to speak, is the first step, is the first thing we have to do before just being able just to kind of extract this sort of left brain analysis of why it falls short in all these ways. We also need to be able to do that. That's an important skill, but it's much more difficult and also incisive to examine ourselves and to say, well, what is it really? What are the longings, or what are the ways that this is opening up the world to me? Why do I love this? Why do I find this helps me cope, right? Why do I find that this, I don't know if I told this story, maybe I told the story at the Colson Center, but we had a student who passed away a year ago, just a few months before graduation. And there is this event that was set aside to sort of honor him and to remember him. And I was just really struck by how often his friends mentioned how much he loved Marvel movies. And, on one level you think, wow, Marvel movies, I mean, obviously they're this big cultural phenomenon, but it seems like a pretty trivial thing to talk about when you're remembering someone's life. And yet to this student and his friends, those movies mattered. They mattered as bits of culture, but I would also argue they mattered in some sense as theology, right? As something that gave meaning to the world in a very real sense. And so I take popular culture and its formative effect on us incredibly seriously, because in the real world, we take it incredibly seriously, right? So much so that when we remember friends, we remember watching Marvel movies and debating them with each other. And that's really the sort of pastoral or missionary heart behind my work, is really just this conviction that culture matters to us a lot more than we like to admit, and rightly, because that's part of what it means to be human. Our cultural life is one of the best parts about being human. And it is deformed, and it does need to be discipled. But the first movement is one in which we discern our own hearts and say, well, why? Why do I love Marvel movies so much? Or why do I love this particular musical artist so much? Or why does it matter to me so much whether or not the Kansas City Royals are any good, right? Like what's going on there at a heart level, and what does God think about that? What does that have to do with my life before God?
I'm talking today with Dr. Justin Bailey, author of Interpreting Your World, 5 Lenses for Engaging Theology and Culture. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Hi, Upstream listeners. This is Shane Morris. Every week on Upstream, you hear how the Christian worldview informs our understanding of every part of life, from nature to music to social media. Perhaps these discussions have raised further questions for you. That's why I'm happy to announce the release of a new free digital resource, 5 books on public theology. This resource features my recommendations and reflections on books that have shaped my understanding of the Christian worldview, including questions like, what constitutes reality? Is Scripture the only way to understand right and wrong? And where is history headed? If you're looking for trustworthy books that'll challenge you and grow your understanding of how Christianity speaks to all of reality, this resource is for you. Download your copy today at colsoncenter.org/public theology. We're back on Upstream talking with Dr. Justin Bailey about what it means to engage the culture and what the culture even is. Dr. Bailey, as we're kind of wrapping up our broad discussion and moving into the specifics of the book, the 5 lenses through which we can interpret culture, I want to ask a preliminary question that I think anticipates a potential objection or concern that many of my listeners will have, and that is about the whole issue of worldview analysis, right? So a moment ago, we were talking about how engagement with culture or cultural artifacts can't be reduced to this sort of grid approach where you look at this movie or this book or this piece of music or whatever, this play, and you say, this is what it's teaching, this is the worldview it's coming from, these are the assumptions, and we've got it all figured out, right? It's all on the map. A lot of us have been taught to do things that way, and a lot of us have found a great deal of usefulness in making sense of the world in that way. Are you saying that that's bad? And if not, how does it balance with the approach that you're describing?
No, I don't think so. I don't think I'm saying it's bad. I see that sort of worldview analysis as a particular tool, a particular approach. And like all tools, it's going to have certain things it does better than others, right? I think especially with when I was working in junior high and high school ministry, that sort of analysis was very helpful to give them just a basic handhold of what it would mean to notice the differences in worldview questions and the way those things are being answered. I guess what I am saying, though, if we only have one tool, we're going to be limited in the sort of things we're able to build, this sort of work that we're able to do. And so I am not, again, replacing that tool so much as offering a broader range of questions, a broader range of tools, a broader range of lenses. Maybe that's the reason why I use the idea of lenses, because I think that as we bring all these lenses to bear, we have a stronger hold or a stronger grasp on the conversation that we're engaged in. As you know, my mentor Kevin Van Hooser, who wrote the foreword to this book, he talks about thin descriptions versus thick descriptions, right? And so a thin description is one that only pays attention to one or two things, like maybe one layer of analysis, whereas a thick description allows life to unfold in all its complexity. And most things are very complex, So for example, if you're talking to somebody from another faith, another religion, you might have the things that you've learned in a book that religion teaches. But then when you're actually with a person, they actually might have beliefs that are quite different, dissonant, that don't match up with what you've been, and you have the person in front of you, right? They're not an abstract set of ideas. They're a living, breathing person with hopes, desires, and struggles, and all of those things. And this is the person that the Lord has brought to you to talk to, right? And so I think most people who have a sort of emotional intelligence would know that apologetics or even just conversation cannot just be a matter of memorizing the right things to say. If they say this, then you say that, which
you mean I can't meet someone on the bus and be like, all right, this is an instantiation of the Marxist worldview right here.
That's
and I'm going to run all the plays that I've learned for Marxists.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And again, in the same way, in any sport or thing that you can run plays, right? There are particular strategies that might be helpful for you. But when you're actually playing a sport, things break down, right? As Mike Tyson said, everybody has a game plan until they get punched in the face, right? And so life is complex, right? And it requires us to be nimble, and it requires us to be patient and to be willing to listen and learn. As James says, quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to become angry. And so that's the sort of posture that I'm hoping that this book engenders, the sort of habits, as you mentioned, of asking different sorts of questions in hopes that maybe a different sort of conversation might result because of it.
Okay, so let's talk about the 5 lenses, because these are very helpful ways of looking at the whole issue. And I think much more, if not perhaps exhaustive, much more revealing for what it means to be a culture maker, to live in culture and to participate in and critique it. So the first one is the meaning dimension, culture as immune system. And I found this one particularly evocative because, well, you compare it to sneezing, for instance, right? And we all know what it feels like to interact with a person, a flesh and blood person, who has an immune response, a visceral reaction to something we say or believe or profess. And we all know what it feels like to have that same reaction. Talk to us about the meaning dimension.
Yeah, so the meaning dimension, I was trying to capture the way that culture is contagious. I was taught, and maybe this is a bit of another metaphor to get at it. I was taught in seminary to analyze culture as a text. So a text is a world and work of meaning. And so the same way that we can interpret scripture through the skills of hermeneutics, of exegesis, we can also do that with culture. We can learn to read, for example, the signs of the times. We can interpret and exegete culture. And indeed, the name of this book is Interpreting Your World. So I'm still very much a fan of that. I'm very much a fan of cultural hermeneutics or cultural exegesis. But the one limitation of that metaphor of culture as a text that we can interpret is, I have a text here and I can pick it up, put it down, you know what I mean? It's sort of remote from me. It's detached from me. And it doesn't quite capture the way that culture is contagious. The way that things spread like viruses, like memes, right? This is the whole idea of memes. Memes are these viral bits of culture that spread throughout the world. And this was before, meme took on this whole new meaning that it has now of these little graphics, graphic files or things like that. But a meme is a little bit of culture that spreads like a virus. And I found this imagery of viral, we talk about something going viral, to be really helpful just in the way that we think about culture. And if you think about all of us having this sort of cultural immune system, so that as you move through the world, there are certain things that your immune system takes in as healthy for you, and certain things that it guards itself, it fights against. And you know it when you sneeze, right? You know it when you have a temperature that goes up, right? And this happens not just on a physiological level, but it happens on a cultural level, right? That there are certain ideas or people, on social media that you have this immune system response to. Before it even gets to your intellect, your body reacts to it, right? You feel defensive. You feel like you're ready to fight against it. And I felt like that just kind of really captured the way that culture acts to give us a sense of stability and security in the world. And so naturally, when we encounter a sort of rival immune system, a rival way of seeing the world, we might feel threatened by that, right? And so that's what I'm sort of playing with, is the way that when we talk about meaning is not just something that we sort of extract from a text or extract from a cultural artifact, but that meaning is something that enables us to feel secure and then also enables us to sort of go out into the world because we feel secure. And so that's what I was trying to get at with the meaning dimension. It's this question that it answers. So if we talk about the sort of magnetic questions, am I securely connected in the world? Am I stable? Right. So I use the example of this time when I was in Russia, just above Mongolia, and I got lost in this, Russian neighborhood, and my language skills weren't great, and it was night, and I didn't know where I was, and I felt as frightened as I had ever felt before up until I had kids. And this is what I mean, that we can experience cultural situations where you feel like there's no tethers connecting you to anything. And then the difference between that and, for example, where I'm sitting right now in my parents' house, there's all of these tethers of meaning everywhere I drive. I walk down the street and I see the houses of neighbors, and I'm very securely fit in this cultural space where I grew up. And so if you sort of think about the meaning dimension of culture as this struggle to have a sense of security, a sense of feeling like I fit, I'm at home in this world, even as I explore the broader world. And so what ultimately are the things that are going to secure us, make us feel secure, especially if you're in this multicultural world, this world of pluralistic perspectives. And ultimately, the thing that secures us, that gives us the deepest meaning, has to be the story that we are given in the gospel of Christ. And so that's what I'm trying to do in each of these chapters, is to listen to the conversation as it's already happening, which is a way of saying that all of these 5 things are things that we are always already engaged with. We're always interested in, we're always talking about, we're always thinking about. We just don't always name it as such. And they're deeply theological, which is why I always tell my students, you're always doing theology. You just might not name it as such. And so that's the meaning dimension.
One of the dimensions or lenses that has become all-consuming for us is really the next one. These days, it seems like everything is being framed as a power play. Yeah. So this is the power dimension. And you see this in terms of oppression with race and sex and gender, and the idea that there are dominant groups in society that are trying to keep others down. And this gets into, a lot of, we maybe even talk about things like critical race theory and all of that. But this idea that everything we do is a power play and somebody's trying to either take you in or assert dominance over you has become ubiquitous for us. And it seems like to me, what you're doing here is as much backing off of that as an all-encompassing way of understanding the world as you are explaining how it's true. So differentiate between those two for us and explain the power dimension.
Yeah, that's very well put. So the power dimension answers the question, do I have real agency or am I at the mercy of greater powers, right? And so we always ask that no matter what our cultural situation is. So if you're in a more animistic culture, the powers might be the spirits, right? In a more modern capitalistic culture, it might be the market or the state, right? Are the powers that are supposed to be oppressing you. Or it might be some sort of, all the things that you mentioned in terms of the dominant structures of thought. So I both want to take the power dimension seriously, but I also want to say that in the same way we just said, if that's the only thing we see, we won't see much. In the same way that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There's something about doing power analysis that is quite addictive and it makes us feel powerful, which one of the things that the Christian story does is it's meant to humble us. And it's meant to humble us because when we start to see power and start critiquing power, it becomes very easy for us to sort of become powerful, right? To put ourselves in that place. And the gospel is trying to humble all of us and put us at the foot of the cross, I think. But part of what I'm doing, I distinguish in my book between what we call an iconoclasm of cancellation or replacement and an iconoclasm of complication. And I say that there's a time and a place for both. Like I said before, there are times to throw your CDs away, and there are times when you have to be really honest about the way that the oppression has occurred. Power imbalance has destroyed image bearers. But the temptation always is that when we pull someone else off the pedestal, that we get up on the pedestal and say, well, we're on the right side of history or something like that. And I'm just, as a Christian,
kind of Orwell's analysis. It's like when the pigs liberate everybody in the barnyard from the oppressive farmer, pretty soon they become the farmer. They're sitting in the farmer's bed and commanding everyone.
Yeah. And so what I suggest is that the sort of iconoclasm or the sort of challenge that we need to make is one that is more of complication, to complicate the stories, to complicate the narratives, to tell more complete stories than the ones we've been telling. And how, Jesus does flip the tables, but usually he sits at them and asks complicating questions. My use of five lenses is in some ways a complication of the dominant cultural narratives that say that it's all about power. I want to say, there is a power dimension, but the fact that it's only one of the five lenses lets you know that if you only talk about power, you're going to miss a lot of things. In fact, I have a dear friend who, when I wrote this chapter, said, I was trying to do power and ethics in the same chapter. And he said, really, you should separate these two chapters because it's one thing to deconstruct and to reveal the ways that power has been misused, but we also need to build something new. We need to build institutions that are marked by righteousness, justice, and peace. And that is a sort of a different thing than the critical diagnosis of the misuse of power. So I wanted to address power as early as possible in the book. Culture is not just about meaning, but it's also about power. There always will be ways in which particular people are pushed to the margins and other people's are centered. That's the way that power works. In fact, there might even be people on the other side of the boundary. And what Christian faith does is it doesn't remove the human desire to have boundaries, right, as far as what is right and wrong, but it does teach us to use our power in a very different way, right? Not so among you, Jesus says. And so that's what I'm trying to do in this chapter, is to help us, number one, see power and take it seriously, but also that this would not be the only thing that we see. And as I say in the chapter, it makes sense to me. So there's a big part of power is who gets to name the world, right? Who gets to say the way that things are, right? And so there's all sorts of battles and what language should we use for the way that things are? Because language matters. I think that what the gospel compels us to do is to both take seriously the names that we have for ourselves, as well as the names that others have tried to give us. But all of those names ultimately have to be open to surprise with the names that come from God, right? With the identities that come from God. And the example I use is Naomi, right? Who goes through this situation and tries to rename herself as bitter rather than sweet. And that moment is named, right? And she is given the space in the story to say that. And yet, there is a larger perspective. And so, no, she is not renamed ultimately. She is redeemed. And that her story takes on this much larger significance than she thought it could ever have.
I couldn't help think, as you were talking about how seeing everything as a power play can blind us to the breadth of what's really going on. I couldn't help thinking of my favorite example of people who had blinded themselves in a story, and that is the dwarves in C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, right? Where they can't see the beautiful reality around them because they're so afraid of someone running another power play on them. And it's a tragic picture as well as a cautionary tale, because they really had suffered power plays run on them. They really had been deceived by wicked people, and they were rightly suspicious because of that. But your suspicion of power plays being run on you can turn around and act as a blinder to actually keep you from not only recognizing the beauty and truth in the world, but from salvation itself. Lewis is suggesting there, and that's pretty scary. We need to guard ourselves against the spirit of seeing everything as somebody trying to pull the wool over our eyes or pull a fast one on us. I like that.
That's right. Yeah, and the language he uses is they're so afraid of being taken in that they cannot be taken out.
Right.
Of their willful ignorance, of the refusal to entertain the possibility that they could be rescued, and that there could be truth, and that there could be goodness, and there could be beauty.
Okay, so we got a few minutes here to briefly skim the last three, and I want to emphasize that this is not a summary of the whole thing to the extent that you can listen to this and no, go read the book. But this hopefully will whet your appetite. Okay, so the ethical, yes, yeah, there you go. Oh, spoken like a true author. I love it. So let's talk about the ethical dimension here, if we can.
Sure. Yeah.
Culture as a moral boundary. What does that mean?
That's right. So in this chapter, I'm trying to get at the ways that all humans ask the question, what does it mean to be a good human? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean to be a good member of the community? And that requires the drawing of moral lines, right? All people do this, right? And we might call this, that might be encoded into law. It might be just cultural mores. It might be community standards. It might be social practices. But we can't help but draw lines between what is right and what is wrong, because as Paul tells us, the law is actually written on our heart. We can't escape it. And so the chapter on ethics sort of explores what we do with this, and the way that we often use ethics as more a matter of belonging rather than behaving, right? So that I'm trying to show that I'm a good person through the way I conform to my sense of what it means to be good. But again, as I said, there's something right about that, right? We are responding to a real question that is posed to us because the law is written on our heart and we live in a moral universe. And as much as we try to emancipate ourselves and say, well, everything's relative, all of us still feel upset when someone cuts us off in traffic or something like that, right? Because we live in a moral universe. And there's no...
as Lewis says, notice nobody ever appeals to their own personal preference. Nobody ever says, you cut me off in traffic. That's inconvenient for me.
Yeah, that's right.
Therefore, that's the basis on which I'm... Yeah. No, they say that's wrong. You disobeyed some rule that transcends both of us. Everyone does it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And I think that what I'm trying to show in this chapter is that there is definitely an element of belonging that informs our moral systems that we create, but the deepest kind of belonging is belonging to God. And because you mentioned Lewis, he says as well, if I belong to someone else, then I should have a lot of responsibilities I should not have if I belong to myself, which means that every cultural system of morality, of line drawing, is subject as well to Scripture, right? To the commands or the claims that are made on us by the God to whom we belong because we are made in his image.
This is interesting to me because of the way that the other cultural side, if we can put it that way, draws these boundaries and then assumes them and then exhibits moral outrage and revulsion toward Christian ideas and values on the basis of those assumed values. And some of them even have their roots in Christianity. And this is what's so odd and potentially confusing about it at times. So I wrote a piece at the Gospel Coalition a couple of weeks ago about a music video that came out by Derek Webb, who is the former lead singer of Caveman's Call. And in it, he is essentially transformed into a drag queen, right? And he sings about how, in essence, Jesus would accept this because Jesus loved sinners, right? He ate with sinners. And the proud and fearful Pharisees, well, they turned away from people like that, but Jesus wouldn't do it. And so therefore, what I'm doing is beautiful, right? And the interesting part about that is it's taking a Christian instinct and turning it on itself, turning it against Christian anthropology. It's like a kind of cancer that's turned against the body that, in essence, produced it. And that's informative to me because the lines and boundaries that our culture has drawn and which we find ourselves transgressing and which turn against us in anger, in many ways have some common source with Christianity. And that, to me, that helps situate the whole like moral outrage that we encounter and make sense of it. But it also prepares me with a better posture for like engaging that because I know its source. I share that source in some way.
Yeah, and there's a hunger for justification, right? A hunger for recognition, because it really is not enough just to say, well, this is who I am. You have to also say, accept me for who I am, right? And there is some sense, of course, in which we show love to every person who bears God's image. But the insistence on the acceptance, right, is itself a line. And again, you can't not draw lines. That makes sense that somebody wants to draw a line. But the question is, how do you treat people on the other side of the line? And Christian faith is unique in that although it does draw lines, it also has a particular posture towards people on the other side of the line, right? So Jesus says that we love our enemies and we pray for those who persecute us and we bless when cursed and we forgive our enemies. And so I think that one of the places where moral systems that happen allegedly apart from God often fail is that there's no space in them for what happens when you fail and what happens when you don't live up and when you are not approved and when you are not recognized and accepted by others and you still hunger for justification. So you either force others to justify you somehow or you have to find that somewhere else. And so I think that the unique thing about the gospel is the way that it calls us to treat people who are on the other side of the line. And that is a distinctive, I think, of the moral system that we find in Christian faith.
So we're on to the religious dimension here, and again, we're just doing these like very cursory samples of each lens, each chapter. But the religious dimension, for me, the thing that immediately came to mind, I mean, it just immediately suggests itself, is the Disney experience, right? So culture as a sacred experience. One of the things that we see come up again and again is people attributing a kind of sacred or mystical or magical, not in the branding sense, but really magical experience associated with the stories and characters of Disney. And you see, for instance, news, headlines about people getting their ashes sprinkled at the Magic Kingdom or something like that. And I mean, that makes me a little more nervous about, the rides and flower beds there. I live here in Florida, but there's something going on there. People have found a sacred experience in this otherwise seemingly trivial aspect of culture. What's going on there, and how do you analyze culture from a religious dimension?
Oh man, we should do a whole podcast on Disney because it is one of the largest myth makers in our society, right? In terms of giving us stories. I already referenced Marvel, which is owned by Disney, and the way that it gives us these immersive worlds to inhabit that are enchanting to us. And in a disenchanted world, we long to be enchanted again. And so it's natural, it makes sense that people would invest religious energies into things that are not traditionally thought of as religious. The religious dimension is this dimension in which we work out both the anxieties of living and the certainty of dying. So is there anything more right now in my everyday life, or is sort of matter and energy all that there is? And then is there anything more when I die, or is the end of my life the end of it all, right? And so traditionally people have turned to religious systems to answer these questions, both to help them cope with the anxiety of living, but also to give them some sort of security in the face of death. Increasingly, though, in a secularizing world, well, I mean, religion is doing as well as ever. It's just been embedded into all these secular things, right? So that people are giving religious devotion to the National Football League or to Mickey Mouse or to Disney, right? And that these are the mythologies, the stories, the religious structures that give us the sense that help us cope, right? That give us, there's pilgrimages, right, to the Magic Kingdom, right? And then even that's where I want my ashes, someone wants their ashes to be spread. And it's necessarily an immersive experience, right? That's the thing that Disney does so well, is these immersive experiences in which we get caught up in something larger than ourselves. And so the chapter on religion really deals with the way that we do this culturally, both in traditional religious systems, but also in non-traditional things. And what we find is that when the things that we invest our religious identities into are trivial, they might give us the sort of a substitution for the meaning that might be found in a traditional religion, but they don't really fulfill us, right? It's not enough to organize a life. It's not enough to organize a community. Really, it's not thick enough, right? And so a lot of times what happens is these things can become consuming of us. They can become addictive. They can become something that ultimately takes from us rather than giving to us. But then when the things that we treat religiously are not trivial, when it becomes something on the level of racism or something like that, it actually then requires us to destroy others. And so religion has this intensifying power for all of our cultural pursuits because it takes on this incredible scale of this is, as Ernst Becker would say, an immortality project. This is a way that I will live after I die. Think of the Tower of Babel, for example, as an immortality project. And all of us sort of trying to build our own kingdoms that will give us some sense of endurance or immortality in the face of the knowledge that we're going to die. And this is the reason as well why the gospel comes in and has a critique of religiosity, of human religiosity, of the things that we build to secure ourselves, and offers us in the place of religion, so conceived, grace, the gospel, right? Which, again, doesn't replace the religious instinct, but resituates it in the direction of Christ.
I think one of the instincts people often have is to just say, especially in our time, is to just say, I don't have religious instincts in the sense that you're talking about it, Justin. I just have like default, basic, decent human desires, like the desire to give my children a world that's better than the world that I grew up in, or the desire to keep some global threat like climate change from unalterably destroying the world that we live in, right? To be on the right side of history, right? The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. This a lot of this is language that, particularly during Barack Obama's presidency, that he really leaned on to give a transcendent flavor to a lot of his political projects. And I think most of the people who are in that same secular orbit that nevertheless considers itself very moral and very upright and very progressive would deny that they're doing a religious project, but those transcendent appeals that it makes are fundamentally religious. And I'm not saying all of them are bad, but not by any means, but I am saying they're fundamentally religious and that there's an inescapable project going on here. You can't just step outside of this lens. Everybody is going to be doing this with the world in some way or another.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so the last lens that we need to deal with is the aesthetic dimension. So culture as a poetic project. I love something that you said earlier. Maybe it was in the book because I was reading it just before we got on here. And that is you quoted a poem and you said that if you were to go back, and yeah, you did say this in the discussion earlier, that if you were to go back and say, okay, what was the message of that poem? Like, give me bullet points about the meaning of the poem. Immediately, you'd have to look back because you weren't reading the poem on the level of what is it saying in that concrete sense. You were encountering it as a poem. This is another human register on which culture works and in which Christianity works. Help us understand the aesthetic dimension, culture as a poetic project. What does that mean?
Yeah. So poetic is something that we make or do. So if you think about the life that you are making, I mean, most people will, even if you don't think of yourself, I have students who say, "Oh, I'm not creative," and I always say, "Yes, you are, because you're made in God's image." But what they mean is I'm not artistic, right? I'm not working as a professional artist or something like that. And yet all of us live aesthetically. All of us, some of my students, they'll put stickers on their laptops or their cars, or they'll decorate their room a particular way, their desk, right? We're all trying to live a life that is generative and beautiful, right? And we instinctively know that there are some things that feel more beautiful to us than others, or that elicit our delight and our desire, awaken our desire in particular ways. And we live on this level. I mean, you've just mentioned it, the way that people, this desire to have a life that is generative for the next generation, that I pass on to my children, is an aesthetic thing, right? And so this is the dimension of culture in which we sort of ask the question, why? Why do we find particular things beautiful? What is a beautiful life? What would it look like to live a life that is beautiful? And how does that change the question when you say, well, what does it mean to be a good person? Is a different question in some ways than what does it mean to live a life that is beautiful? Because beauty comprehends now some additional dimensions of delight and desire and generativity. And so one of the best ways into this discussion is that there are some things that we do just for the heaven of it, right? Just for the joy and the delight that we find in it. So if you think about that phrase, people will use just for the hell of it and contrast it to just for the heaven of it, then you have really a profound difference between a secular and a Christian worldview. That there are many things that we do as Christians just for the heaven of it. And that is suggestive of what heaven might be like and what the world is like. And that the world is a place in which there is brutality, but the beauty is deeper than the brutality, that the joy is deeper. And I think this is one of the things that Tolkien expresses better than almost anyone else, right? The sense of deeply wrestling with how broken the world is, and yet there is grace that breaks in. And so to be attentive to aesthetics is to be attentive to this layer of reality that cannot quite be captured in propositional language, right? That is felt, right? And that elicits our tears sometimes because of its beauty. And so what I was trying to get at in this chapter is the way that we do things that are for more than functional purpose, right? We do things because we are aesthetic creatures who have delight and desire and are meant to because we're made in the image of a God who creates in joy. And so my hope is that in our aesthetic pursuits, as they are healed, that we see foretastes of the good world to come, in which, one of the best pictures of this is in Zechariah, who is describing the Jerusalem healed, and he says, and the streets of that city will be filled with children playing in the streets. That there's something about children at play. And why are they doing what they're doing? Just for the heaven of it. Why are they blowing bubbles? Why are they building sandcastles? Why are they inventing games? Just for the heaven of it, right? Just because of the joy that is found in it. And that's a layer of culture too, in which we appreciate and make things just for the heaven of it. Now, of course, our making is fallen, our imagining is fallen and needs to be healed. But what I'm trying to get at is the fact that there is this layer of culture that is characterized by joy and transcendence, and how that might point us to the source of it all.
So here's my last question, and we are over time here, but this has been just such an illuminating discussion. I feel like there will be listeners out there who get the sense that they have been living with one sense for their whole Christian lives, that they've been taught to look at culture and look at their faith in one way. And all of a sudden, you've just turned on all five senses, right? And they're just like a person who gets their eyesight all of a sudden, or you ever seen those videos of someone who gets a cochlear implant and they turn it on and then they start to hear the world, they hear their loved ones' voices for the first time. And it's always this reaction of just, they're shocked. I mean, the shock on their face is obvious. I think that's what many people who read this book and who really adopt these lenses for looking at culture will be experiencing. Their senses are so attuned now. What's the next thing they ought to do after that? What's the next step after you've kind of woken up all these senses for them?
That is a great question. And I think that it is true to the experience that my students have. Most of the time my students are used to operating on the ethical dimension. They'll sort of just make ethical judgments about cultural artifacts. Outside the walls of the church, as you've mentioned, the power dimension is usually the one that people interact with. And so first, I'll just say maybe all of us are always already working on all these five lenses, right? It's in the same way that we're always using our five senses, right? We just don't, it hasn't been named that way, right? And so in everyone's life, they are already asking the question, what does it mean for me to be a good human? They're already trying to navigate the anxiety of life and the certainty of death. They're already trying to live a life that is beautiful in some sense. And so that would be the first thing. It's just the best thing to do is first, just pay attention to the way that you face up to those questions. And how has your cultural situation formed you to interact with those questions? How is it forming you? And what is the hope of the gospel in each of those questions? And then the second thing I do, just maybe more practically, is just start by adding one lens. Just pick one other lens. So if you realize, well, I usually use this power lens. So, well, what would it be like for me to add the aesthetic lens to this, and to not just see things as a power play, but as power, but poetry, right? What's the interaction between those two? Or if somebody is very, more aesthetically inclined, well, okay, maybe you do need to see a bit more of the way that power situates things. And so I would just say practically, it's probably best to just add one more lens rather than trying to use all five at the same time. And again, this is not the first or the final word on cultural interpretation. It's really a way of saying that things are incredibly complex and beautiful in their complexity, but also terrifying in their complexity. And the thing that I always want to emphasize to readers is we can only go far into culture to the degree that we have gone down deep into discipleship. And so we have to have deep roots in the things that actually secure us, in the one who actually secures us, in order to be able to go far in interacting with all these cultural artifacts. So perhaps that would be what I say, is just to pick one and make sure you're going down deep as long as you're also trying to go out far.
That's really helpful. Well, my guest today has been Dr. Justin Bailey, author of Interpreting Your World, 5 Lenses for Engaging Theology and Culture. Dr. Bailey, thank you for writing this book and for sticking with me a little longer on this conversation. I sometimes I'll tune into the Joe Rogan podcast and I'll see that he's gone 3 hours with a guest. And I just think, man, to have a podcast where I had that kind of prerogative, but I'm not there yet. So thank you for going a few minutes over with me. This was super fun.
It's been my pleasure, Shane. Thank you.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media or by visiting upstream.colsoncenter.org.